They say silence keeps the peace, that walking away is maturity, that avoiding conflict makes you a better person. But what if that silence isn't peace, just pressure quietly building beneath the surface? What if the person who never argues is fighting 1,000 unseen battles within? There is a quiet pattern, often praised but rarely understood, a silent epidemic of emotional avoidance. Why do some people fear conflict so deeply, and what does it cost them over time? Let's begin. There is a certain kind of person who rarely says no, not because everything feels right, but because saying no feels dangerous. So they smile, they nod, they agree, even when something inside them hesitates. It happens quickly, almost automatically. A request is made, and before their mind can fully process it, their mouth has already said yes. Why? Because conflict, even in its smallest form, feels heavier than discomfort. To them, disagreement isn't just a difference of opinion. It feels like a risk, a shift, a possible fracture in connection. So they choose peace, or at least what looks like peace. But is it really peace if it costs them their truth? There is a quiet tension that follows these moments, a subtle tightening in the chest, a lingering thought that whispers, "That wasn't what you really wanted." And yet, they move on. They tell themselves it's not a big deal, that it's easier this way. But over time, these small silences begin to accumulate. Like sediment at the bottom of a river, unspoken thoughts begin to settle. No one is born afraid of disagreement. A child does not naturally fear saying, "I don't like this," or "I don't want that." In the beginning, expression is simple, honest, unfiltered, immediate. So what changes? Somewhere along the way, expression meets consequence. Maybe it was the raised voice that came too quickly, the silence that followed honesty, the subtle withdrawal of warmth after a boundary was set. Or perhaps it wasn't loud at all. Sometimes it's quieter than that. A parent who looked disappointed. A room that grew cold after disagreement. A feeling, small but sharp, that love became uncertain the moment conflict appeared. And for a child, uncertainty in love feels like danger. So the mind begins to learn. It starts making quiet associations. Disagreement leads to distance. Truth leads to tension. Expression risks connection. And slowly, a pattern forms. Not consciously, not deliberately, but carefully. To the outside world, a disagreement is just words. A pause in conversation. A difference in opinion. A moment of tension that usually passes. But inside the mind of someone who avoids conflict, it is not just words. It is a signal. Something deeper gets activated, quietly, instantly, without permission. The body reacts before thought can catch up. A tightening in the throat, a subtle pressure in the chest, a sudden urge to escape, explain, soften, agree. Because the brain is not asking, "Is this argument real?" It is asking, "Is this safe?"
And when past experiences have linked conflict with emotional loss, rejection, or instability, the nervous system does not distinguish between then and now. It remembers the feeling, not the timeline. So even a small disagreement can feel disproportionately large. Not because the situation is extreme, but because the internal alarm system is sensitive. Over time, the brain learns a strategy. Reduce threat by reducing friction. Stay agreeable. Stay calm. Stay non-disruptive. Not as personality, but as protection. This is where conflict avoidance becomes less about choice and more about conditioning. The mind begins to prioritize emotional safety over emotional truth. But safety comes at...
There is a moment, quiet, almost invisible, that happens inside a person who avoids conflict. A thought appears. I should say something. It is small at first, soft, almost harmless. But immediately, another voice follows. What if it changes everything? And just like that, a war begins. Not outside, inside. One part of them wants honesty, the relief of saying what is real, the freedom of no longer carrying unspoken weight. But another part is already preparing for the cost, the distance that might follow, the silence that could grow, the emotional shift that feels heavier than the truth itself. So they pause. They calculate. They soften the words. They edit themselves in real time. Until what could have been truth becomes something safer, something acceptable, something less likely to disturb connection.
It rarely arrives as a dramatic revelation. There is no sudden breakdown, no clear turning point marked by certainty. Instead, it comes quietly, in ordinary moments. A pause after saying yes again. A familiar discomfort that lingers longer than before. A thought that feels slightly more honest than it used to. I didn't want that. And then, silence. Not the external kind, the internal kind. Because something is different now. What once felt normal starts to feel noticeable. The automatic agreement, the softened responses, the instinct to smooth over tension before it forms. They begin to feel visible, almost like watching a pattern unfold in slow motion that was always there, but never observed closely enough. And with that awareness comes something unfamiliar. Not pain exactly, not clarity either, but recognition. A subtle understanding that avoidance is not empty. It is full of unsaid sentences, unexpressed needs, moments of self-erasure disguised as peace. And now the question begins to form, quietly, carefully. How much of life has been shaped by what was never said? It is not asked with anger, not with blame.
There is a common misunderstanding about conflict, that it always breaks things, that it always separates, that it always destroys something fragile between people. But in reality, not all conflict is rupture. Sometimes it is honesty trying to breathe. For the person who has lived inside avoidance, this idea feels unfamiliar, because silence has long been mistaken for safety, and agreement has often been mistaken for peace. But something begins to shift when awareness deepens. Not loudly, not forcefully, softly. A moment where truth is felt and not immediately erased.
a sentence forming in the mind and not instantly edited, a need appearing and not automatically dismissed. This is where courage begins to change shape, not as confrontation, not as intensity, but as presence. The ability to stay with oneself